Welcome to Unit 12 of the TESOL course at Southern Utah University. In this video, we'll focus on input, output, and interaction as they relate to second language acquisition. We'll also talk about the four strands of language learning. So input, as we know, is dealing with the language skills of listening and reading. And input can be described in two ways, as simplified and non-simplified. Simplified input is often very helpful for language learners. If we can simplify the forms, use more common vocabulary, learners are more likely to have comprehensible input then that they can use. Non-simplified input would be more authentic language, which has not been created or designed specifically for language learners. The reality is language learners need to have both. They need to have some comprehensible input that's been simplified for their level, but they also need to be challenged with some authentic language, so that's ultimately their goal to where they want to be. We can think of both interactive and non-interactive input. So interactive input is where a learner is expected to receive the input, but then also be expected to engage with it and participate. So a conversation, for instance, would be interactive input. Non-interactive input is just when the learner is just receiving the input and is not expected to respond to it. So this might be watching a movie or reading a book. We're receiving that input, but there isn't an expectation of participation. Input can also be described as both positive and negative. So by positive input, what we mean is input that is showcasing and demonstrating how the language works. But negative input is also valuable for language learners. Negative input are the things that should not be done in the language, errors, mistakes, how the language doesn't work. And learners learn from both of these. They learn from positive input, these good models of how the language work, but then they also learn from negative input by learning, oh, I can't do that in the language. And this can be especially helpful when the negative input contrasts how the language might work in the learner's first language versus the second language. So they understand, oh, I cannot do this with English, even though I can do it with my native language. Another important part of input is noticing. So noticing is the idea that a learner, instead of focusing on the meaning of language, they stop and they start focusing on the forms and the structures. And they pay better attention to, oh, here's some specific words or phrases or grammatical structures. Noticing is an important part of using input to bring it closer to acquisition, as we talked about with that monitor hypothesis. Some researchers also make the distinction with the idea of intake. So input could be different from intake. Input is you're just receiving it, but intake means you're noticing it, you're understanding it, and ultimately you're acquiring it. So input is important, but for input to really matter, eventually we've also got to have intake. Output is, as we've talked about before, the speaking and writing parts of language. And really, output is most useful and it's necessary for part of the language learning process to encourage learners to create output. Sometimes we talk about this as pushed output, meaning we require learners to create output that fulfills particular tasks or structures that we want them to practice. So pushed output is important because it helps learners practice meaningful communication. It also helps them to test out the language, to figure out what's working, what's not working. When I try to do this, am I resulting in good communication with someone? It helps them better understand how meaning and structure work in the language as they experiment with it. And output also is important because it gives them opportunities to receive feedback and find out, is it working? Am I using structures and communication that people can understand? What's really important about output is as they use output and they get this feedback, they're building their own internal language map of how the new language works. And this map is, if you think about it, kind of like a city map. It starts off as very simplistic. And it's often based on their understanding of how language works in their first language. But the more they receive input and practice output, they're refining this map, and it's becoming much more detailed, and they're better understanding how this new system works and how it's different from their current understanding of language from their first language. So input and output are both very important for language acquisition. In fact, brought together, they're what's called interaction. So interaction is essential to language acquisition. If we don't have interaction, we're not really acquiring that language, we're just learning about it. And an important part of interaction is the idea of negotiation of meaning. Lots of language researchers will talk about the importance of negotiation. And not negotiation necessarily in this kind of political sense, but in a communicative sense, that we are saying something, we try to verify, is it being understood? Is our meaning received? If not, we need to alter our message, try again, and go back and forth to make sure that there's a shared understanding between the participants. So interaction is most successful when the learners are aware of the benefits and the purposes of interaction. That they're not just thinking this is busy work, they're realizing, oh, this is an important part of my learning and acquisition process. I need to practice interaction. It's best if it's part of meaningful communication. They're doing tasks that feel relevant and interesting for them. And that they're not just being required to receive language, but they're also producing language. Examples of interaction could be things like playing games or doing role plays or participating in information gap activities where learners have to communicate with each other in order to solve a task, because some of them have information that the other ones need, and until they share that information with each other, they won't have the complete information that's required for the game or activity or task. So teachers can help with interaction by offering helpful phrases that can be used to complete the interaction task. They can teach about strategies that learners should use when there's a breakdown in communication. What can they do when they don't know what to say? What can they do when they don't understand what's being said? They can also provide lots of class time for interaction, get learners to practice these things in class, but also require them to use interaction outside of the classroom. Design experiences where they have to go beyond the classroom to interact with other users of the language. All of these theories of second language acquisition can come together in what language researcher Paul Nation proposes as the 4 strands of language learning. And Nation was really interested in better understanding how can we design experiences that best help learners acquire language. And so he has said that all language learning should have 4 components. And this table represents those 4 components. In the top left corner, we have language-focused learning. And this would be explicit instruction or practice with the forms of a language. Grammar exercises, learning about when to use what vocabulary versus another vocabulary. All of these things that we think of sometimes traditionally as language teaching, that falls under language-focused learning. Okay, learners need to have those experiences. But then they also need to have, if we look along the bottom, they need to have meaning-focused input opportunities and meaning-focused output opportunities. So they need to have experiences where they're doing listening and speaking at their level, where they can focus on the meaning of things, but also that they're doing writing and speaking at their level, where they can focus on the meaning of a task and communicate. So really that's the negotiation part all along the bottom of our table. Then at the top right, we have fluency development. So once learners have been able to use the language they've learned to practice meaning-focused input and output, then they need to do those same types of things over and over and over again to build their fluency. And so we can't push them too far, have them do things that are not at their level. If we're doing that, then it's not fluency development. Fluency development is using the language that they already know and understand in order to do it more efficiently, effectively, and to move from learning to acquisition. So in this video, we've talked about the importance of both input, output, and interaction for language learning. And we've talked about them within the framework of Nation's 4 strands of language learning.